Every year, thousands of visitors climb the marble steps of a Fifth Avenue mansion, wander past a Vermeer, a Rembrandt, a fountain courtyard that feels borrowed from another century, and never once ask why the man who built this palace of masterpieces once bled through his own shirt onto his office floor. They're standing inside the afterlife of a bullet wound. Henry Clay Frick was shot twice and stabbed 3 times in his own office, and by the next morning he was answering correspondence from his sickbed. That's not the strange part. The strange part is what happened after. Here's the thing about Frick that gets lost in the gore of July 23, 1892. He wasn't supposed to survive it, and the fortune wasn't supposed to survive him. Most Gilded Age dynasties didn't, but Frick's did, not because he dodged tragedy, but because of a decision he made almost 2 decades after the shooting. Hold on to that, we'll come back to it, because it's the whole reason his name still hangs on a museum wall today, while half his rivals' names have vanished from memory entirely. Let's start at the beginning, because Frick didn't arrive at that office chair by accident. He was born in 1849 near West Overton, Pennsylvania, into a family that was comfortable but not rich. His mother's people, the Overholts, ran a whiskey distillery. Frick wasn't interested in whiskey. He was interested in coal, or more specifically, in what coal became when you baked it in a beehive oven for 2 days straight. Coke, the fuel that made modern steelmaking possible. In 1871, in his early 20s, he borrowed money to buy up coal land in the Connellsville region of Pennsylvania and started building coke ovens. By his mid-20s, he controlled thousands of them. By 30, he was a millionaire, and he'd caught the attention of the one man in Pittsburgh who mattered more than anyone else, Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie needed coke to feed his steel mills. Frick had the coke. In 1889, Carnegie made him chairman of Carnegie Brothers and Company, in practice the operating head of the entire Carnegie steel empire. Frick was the details man. Cold, exacting, allergic to sentiment, the kind of executive who read a balance sheet the way other men read scripture. Carnegie supplied the vision and the public charm. Frick supplied the discipline. Together, they built the most efficient steel operation on Earth. As Thinney likes to say, every empire needs a dreamer at the top and a bookkeeper with a spine holding up the walls. Ask yourself something, though. What happens to a company built entirely on one man's ability to squeeze every possible dollar out of every possible worker when that squeezing turns violent? By 1892, Carnegie's 3-year labor contract with the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers covering the Homestead plant outside Pittsburgh was set to expire. Carnegie, publicly a friend of labor in his essays and speeches, quietly left the country to Scotland and handed the entire confrontation to Frick. Frick cut wages. He built a 3-mile fence around the plant, topped with barbed wire, that workers nicknamed Fort Frick. When the Union struck, he brought in 300 armed Pinkerton guards on barges up the Monongahela River to retake the plant by force. On July 6, 1892, strikers and Pinkertons opened fire at each other. When it was over, at least 9 strikers and several Pinkertons were dead. Frick had won the battle for the plant. He had also made himself, in the words of the press at the time, one of the most hated men in America. That hatred walked through his office door 17 days later. On the morning of Saturday, July 23, 1892, a 22-year-old Russian-born anarchist named Alexander Berkman, lover and comrade of the radical Emma Goldman, talked his way past a secretary at Frick's Pittsburgh office wearing a brand-new black suit. Frick was in a meeting with his associate John Lishman. Berkman drew a .38 revolver and fired twice at point-blank range, hitting Frick in the neck. As Frick and Lishman wrestled him to the ground, Berkman managed to stab Frick 3 more times with a dagger before he was finally subdued by office staff and a carpenter working nearby. Frick was bleeding heavily from gunshot and stab wounds, and according to multiple contemporary accounts, he insisted on staying conscious through the doctor's examination, refused anesthesia so he could keep his mind clear for business, and was reportedly dictating correspondence and reviewing Homestead strike telegrams from his bed within a day. This detail is often repeated in popular retellings, and it does appear consistently across period sources close to the event. Even so, treat the clear-headed through the whole ordeal framing as the legend Frick himself was happy to let stand, because it did exactly what he needed it to do publicly. He was back at his desk within roughly 10 days. Finney's take? Nothing kills a labor movement's momentum faster than the villain refusing to die on schedule, and that's precisely what happened. Public sympathy, which had been drifting toward the striking workers after the Pinkerton bloodshed, swung hard in Frick's direction. Berkman wasn't even a union member. He'd acted alone, hoping his attentat would spark a workers' uprising, but the press conflated his attack with the strike itself. The Homestead Union, already weakened, collapsed within months. It would be roughly 40 years before steelworkers organized a union of comparable strength again. Berkman was sentenced to prison and would serve 14 years before his release. So here's the myth as most channels tell it. Tough guy takes a bullet, doesn't blink, wins anyway. End of story, roll credits. But that's not actually why the Frick fortune is still a name on a building instead of a footnote in a Sotheby's catalog. Surviving the assassination attempt didn't secure Frick's legacy. It just kept him alive long enough to make the real decision that did.
If you're the kind of viewer who likes catching the thread before the reveal, there's a museum on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan that most tourists photograph without ever learning the name behind it. It started with a man who nearly bled out over a filing cabinet. Keep that in your back pocket. We're getting there. If you've been with this channel a while, you already know the pattern. Almost every dynasty we cover eventually hits the same wall. The fortune outlives the founder's judgment, and nobody built a structure sturdy enough to survive that gap. Frick's story is one of the rare ones where somebody actually saw that wall coming and built around it. If you want to know which families spotted that wall in time and which ones drove straight into it, that's more or less the entire back catalog of this channel. Subscribe and you won't miss the ones still coming. Now, back to the coke and steel money. Frick's relationship with Carnegie never fully recovered from Homestead, and it curdled completely a few years later over a separate dispute involving Frick's coke company stock. By 1899, the two men who had built an empire together were suing each other and no longer speaking. Frick walked away from Carnegie Steel with a settlement worth roughly $15 million, an enormous sum for the era, and turned his full attention to two things: finance, through his seat on the board of what would become U.S. Steel and his close ties to the Mellon banking interests in Pittsburgh, and art. Frick had been collecting seriously since the 1880s, but after the break with Carnegie, collecting became close to a second career. He bought old masters with the same cold precision he'd once applied to coke ovens: Vermeer, Rembrandt, Titian, Holbein, El Greco, Gainsborough. By the time he moved to New York around 1905, he was assembling one of the finest private collections in the country inside a mansion he built at 1 East 70th Street on Fifth Avenue. Here's the mechanism that actually mattered, and it's not the one most scripts about Frick reach for. The lazy version of this story says rich men either build a monument to themselves or build a real machine to sustain the money. And Frick just built a monument, a mansion full of paintings the same as everyone else who lost the plot. That's not quite what happened. Frick didn't just buy paintings for a private house. Before he died in December 1919, he structured his will so that his Fifth Avenue mansion and the core of his art collection would pass upon his wife's death into an endowed public institution, with its own board and its own funding, what became the Frick Collection, which opened to the public in 1935. That's the real thesis of this episode. Frick's fortune survived, in public memory and in tangible form, because he built a structural vehicle, a purpose-built, professionally governed trust for the one asset that mattered most to him, at a moment when most of his Gilded Age peers were leaving nothing but scattered heirs and a name on a building nobody endowed to last. Compare that to families with no vehicle at all, where an estate simply got divided, sold off, and quietly disappeared within 2 generations. Frick didn't leave that to chance. Finney has a phrase for this one. A painting in a private hallway is a possession. A painting in an endowed trust is a legacy with a lock on the door. It's worth putting this next to a Pittsburgh contemporary who solved the same problem a different way. The Mellon family, Frick's own bankers and business partners, didn't lean on a single museum trust. They built layered banking and holding structures, the kind that let Mellon money flow through generations of controlled institutions rather than a single collection of assets sitting in one estate. Different tool, same underlying instinct. Don't leave a fortune survival up to however the heirs happen to feel about each other in 1935. Give it a skeleton. The families who skipped that step, and there are plenty in this channel's back catalog, usually didn't get a museum. They got a liquidation auction.
Frick himself famously wasn't sentimental about people the way he was precise about structure. His break with Carnegie never healed. When Carnegie, near the end of his own life, reportedly sent word hoping to reconcile, Frick's response, repeated so often it's practically folklore at this point, and worth flagging as exactly that kind of repeated but unverifiable detail, was that Frick would see him in hell, where we both are going. Verified or not, it captures something true about the man: precise with money, merciless with grudges. As Finney would put it, forgiveness was never on Frick's balance sheet. So what actually survived, physically, into the present day? The Fifth Avenue mansion is still there. It underwent a major renovation and expansion completed in 2025, and it remains one of the most visited small museums in New York, holding works by Vermeer, Rembrandt, Titian, and Goya that Frick personally selected. None of it is run by a Frick descendant. That's the point. It didn't need to be. The structure Frick built was designed to outlast his bloodline's interest or competence, which is precisely why it's still standing while so many of his peers' names are attached to nothing more than a defunct holding company or a dispersed art collection sold off at auction sometime in the 1950s. Which brings the story full circle to that bullet. If Berkman's aim had been a few inches truer on July 23, 1892, Frick dies at 43, roughly a decade and a half before he ever builds a structure that made his name durable. There is no Frick collection. There is, at most, a coke and steel fortune quietly absorbed into the churn of early 20th century American capital, indistinguishable from a dozen other regional industrial estates that no one remembers today. The survival of the man wasn't the ending of the story. It was the precondition for the one decision made years later and with far less drama that actually mattered. Finney's closing take: the bullet made him a headline. The trust made him a legacy. Only one of those two things was ever really up to him. That's the trap in most of these stories, and it's the trap Frick, for all his cruelty at Homestead, managed to avoid. Survival buys you time. It doesn't buy you permanence. Permanence has to be built on purpose, usually by someone cold enough or careful enough to plan for a version of the world where nobody in their own family is left to care. So here's what I want to know from you. When you think about the families this channel has covered, the ones who built a real structural vehicle for their fortune versus the ones who just built a mansion and hoped, which family do you think actually cracked the code first? Drop your pick in the comments, and if there's a dynasty you think deserved the Finney treatment next, tell me that too. As for Frick, he took 2 bullets, 3 stab wounds, and a century of bad press, and he's still the one with his name on the door.